What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some of the best parts of my least favorite games. After talking about the worst parts of my favorite games, some people requested I do the reverse, and as people watching the channel may know, I do love a good list video, so naturally, it felt like the right thing to do. Especially since, while there are, I would say, plenty of games I didn't really like that much, if you watch a lot of my reviews, you will notice that I still nonetheless try to point out the things that I think those games do well. Because, especially if your job is reviewing video games, if you are only focusing on the good or the bad, you're not really doing your job. You're supposed to cover both of those things. And while it is incredibly easy to simply do one or the other, the goal should always be to paint a very broad picture of what that game actually is, both good and bad. Which is why, even on games that I dislike, I will still usually have at least one part that I enjoyed about it, which naturally we're going to dive into. Kicking it off right out of the gate with Forspoken, a game that had a very rocky launch, and in many ways I would say felt almost more like an experimental tech demo than a fully fleshed out title. The world and movement was beautiful and smooth in many ways, but ultimately lifeless in the sense that it wasn't really filled with much. And combined with a host of performance issues, combat that was very one note, and you can start to see why Forspoken wound up the way it did. Nonetheless though, there is actually one part of Forspoken that I really enjoyed, and a fair warning, this is going to get a little bit real here. And that is our main character of Frey is shown as homeless in New York before being teleported to the fantastical world of Athia where the bulk of the game takes place. The depiction of her in a homeless situation in New York is actually incredibly well done, and I say that as someone who experienced homelessness myself from the ages of 15 to 17, and while these days I'm 30, going to be 31 in a couple months actually, so it's been quite a while, but what I think Forspoken did really well here was portraying how hopeless that situation feels, how easy it is to be incredibly disregarded. Because when you're homeless, a lot of times people don't really look at you so much as a human being as they do a problem to be solved or just in general a nuisance. They certainly don't care about your feelings, your hopes, your dreams, and I can honestly say that I've never seen a video game so perfectly nail that feeling of how I personally felt when I was homeless as I did in Forspoken. It was genuinely really moving, which of course makes the rest of the game that much more of a shame, to be honest. Moving right along, though it is occurring to me just now that I probably should have saved that one for last, as I doubt I'll be able to top that moving forward, but nonetheless, here we are. In the number 2 spot, we then have Redfall. Released just a few short months after Forspoken, it did catastrophically worse. And while some patches have actually gotten Redfall to a much better state overall, it's still far from where it needs to be, but in Redfall you take on the role of one of a few different vampire hunters trying to save the island of Redfall from, of course, vampires. This game had all sorts of problems, which led to it not particularly being one of my favorites, though I did love the idea. But those problems included AI that was really lackluster, problems with pathing, things getting stuck, the physics were all over the place, alongside a host of other issues. But in spite of all of that, one of the things I really loved about Redfall was actually just the art direction. Moving through the game's sense of stylized realism really did establish a great sense of atmosphere and ambiance that it's a shame the gameplay couldn't quite keep up with. Now, admittedly, I'm a bit of a sucker for this exact type of thing. I'm a big fan of interesting depictions of vampires in media. Oftentimes I think they can be a bit silly, and you can honestly certainly see some of that in Redfall even. But their blending of things like the psychic side of things leading to surreal landscapes across what I would consider almost occult-esque influences, and just the very sleepy, dreary town of downtown Redfall gives so many great set pieces and vistas to see that my favorite thing about Redfall was literally just walking through the world of it. And I do think it's a shame most people are never going to get to see that, given how poorly the rest of the game did. Moving right along to number 3, however, we then have Fable 3, which is an interesting one, because the Fable series is a set of games that I plan on getting around to doing proper retrospective reviews for, as I loved the first Fable. But the follow-ups, 2 and 3, of course, not so much. Now, I did actually recently discover that I have Fable 3 on Steam, which is noteworthy because finding 2 and 3 these days is a little difficult due to the discontinued Games for Windows Live, which means you're usually better off streaming them on PC because even a physical copy won't necessarily work because of Games for Windows Live. But that little side note aside, Fable 3 is not a great game, to be honest, and if you look back at any of the videos and discussion around that game, you'll find that most people don't remember it particularly fondly, and I can't say I disagree with that sentiment, but I will give Fable 3 one thing, and that is that the ideas at play in terms of coming to power and then ruling the land as the king was really neat. Now, throughout the initial plot of the game, you'll be making deals with various people who are going to help you overthrow your brother, I believe it is, and get yourself put on the throne. Once you become king, you then have to focus on either keeping those promises or breaking them while balancing the treasury. And while I love that idea that once you attain the power, the game doesn't necessarily end and then you have to follow up on those things, it's a novel concept. Now, unfortunately, even that concept falls a bit flat because if you know how the game works, it's a bit of a non-decision because doing the right thing or helping out the people you made promises to is supposed to break your bank, which you need to prepare your kingdom for the oncoming onslaught. But if you just take the extra steps to break the economy before these decisions even pop up through the use of things like rentals and jobs, it's actually not a choice at all. You'll have an infinite amount of cash, pretty much, which can lead you down a perfect series of outcomes, completely removing the hard choices and tough decisions that the game tried to set up, which really undercuts basically everything they just did. But I really did love their attempt at hashing that out, even if it didn't quite pan out the way they imagined. Which brings us to number 4, Empire of Sin, and specifically its 1920s gangster mob vibe. Empire of Sin is an odd game. I think it's trying to do too many things, frankly. It's a little bit of grand strategy, a little bit of turn-based tactics, and a little bit of story around a ton of different mobsters you can play as, each with their own quests and individual personalities, that type of thing. And ultimately, it's a game that winds up not doing any one particular thing all that well, and spreading itself a bit too thin. And because of that, I wasn't really into Empire of Sin. However, I do think its focus on these mob bosses, their personalities, their unique effects in combat, the rackets they can get up to, all set within 1920s Chicago, at the height of that sort of Art Deco style, really does make for a fantastic theme, which is what I would say is about the best thing that Empire of Sin has going for it. I was very interested more in the city and these characters than I was the rest of the game. And in fact, if you took this aesthetic and this theme and applied it to a game that was a little more substantial or told you a particular story surrounding these mob bosses, I would definitely be up for playing it, which is why I imagine a series like, say, Mafia did so incredibly well, because the idea here is captivating, but Empire of Sin's portrayal of it left a lot to be desired. Which brings me to my final entry, which just so happens to be Biomutant. Now, I'm not a huge fan of Biomutant, however, I will say that there are actually 2 things I really enjoyed about it. One was a more mechanical thing. You see, Biomutant is set in a post-apocalyptic future where all sorts of bizarre mutated animals roam the land, forming their own societies, getting by the best they can, and we have to try to save what's left of this world from even more toxic pollution, which mechanically leads to areas of the map that are covered in all sorts of different hazards, and through the use of suits you can mitigate your exposure to these areas, which can lead you to some of the game's more secret areas, such as these pools you can mutate your animal in to alter your gameplay and even change how your character looks a little bit, which I thought was a novel concept. And the idea of moving through those hazards, finding unique stuff, unique enemies, is a ton of fun and reminded me a little bit of the earlier Fallouts in a bizarre sort of way. And for that game's many faults, I really did enjoy the exploration of this very vibrant but clearly broken world. That said, that's just the first reason. The other thing, not technically speaking related to the game, that I always remember about Biomutant is that it is the first game my son ever really perked up about. He was about 2.5 when this game released, and I imagine because of, all the animals and big vibrant colors, he was very taken by it. And it was the very first video game I ever saw him get excited for, and the first one he actually sat and played with me. Which is why, even though I don't really care for the game that much, it does bizarrely always have a place in my heart nonetheless, which is a nice way to wrap up this particular video. So I certainly hope you enjoyed it. I'd love to know how you feel about these, or what the best parts of any games you particularly dislike happen to be, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.